about who Christian Aid is, the idea of climate security in a violent world, and whether the idea of climate justice is incompatible with climate security. And to do that, I'm going to look at the impact of violence on the effects of climate change and responses to climate change, and whether or not there is a direct causal link between climate change and violence. I'm going to indulge myself a little bit and talk about Christian Aid approach in these contexts, and finally throw out some, what I'm grandly calling outcomes or suggestions or recommendations, but they're anything but really. They're just kind of suggestions or ideas that might give people some pause for thought. Christian Aid is it's a development agency. It is owned in name by the Protestant churches in Britain and Ireland. It is characterised, I would say, by the fact that it works only through partners. It's not an implementing body. It works through partners in about 40 countries around the world. We've been in existence for 70 years. At the moment, we're working with the support of Irish Aid and the general public, and we work in about 12 countries with that Irish Aid money. We have a focus on issues of governance and human rights. And increasingly that focus on governance and human rights has led us to a realization that tackling violence and addressing the causes and the drivers of violence and trying to building peace is the responsibility of development actors in a way that perhaps not all development actors have taken on board. They work around conflicts, in conflict, but they never actually try to address what the drivers of conflict might be. One of the other characteristics of Christian Aid is that it addresses the structural causes of poverty. And as far back as 2006, Christian Aid were the first international NGO to explicitly make that link between poverty and climate change, which was, at the time, climate change was an area that was dominated largely by environmental bodies, but bringing in the poverty dimension added a much, I think, stronger, compelling, and broader analysis. So, enough about Christian Aid. Climate security and climate justice, are they mutually incompatible agendas? In about 2003 or 4, the international global community, security community, I would say, recognized that climate change was a threat to global security. And there was all kinds of dramatic pronouncements about the effects that climate change is going to have on global security. Everything from mass disease to the breakdown in society to mass migration. Everything was put in the context of climate change and global security. Even to the extent that the Pentagon got involved and started from about 2006 generating an annual report detailing what the threats were to global security and all that comes with insecurity. By 2014, they had an action plan on what that adaptive response to climate change in a security context would look like. But as the Transitional Institute in the US said, the Pentagon may be the last defender of climate science under the Trump administration, but defenders of climate justice they are not. And that is kind of the dilemma. That's the tension between those who view it in very narrow terms, as in purely in a security context, and those like Christian Aid who see it in a broader context, and that is in climate justice. And climate justice, of course, is an idea that's codified in UNFCCC, the big UN institution that looks at climate change and sets the policy agenda for climate change. It's a fundamental principle of that UN framework. And it's what got Christian Aid involved in climate change to begin with, the idea of justice, which is essentially the idea that those who have done least to cause climate change are those that are suffering most. Those who are at the margins of society in whatever country are those that are experiencing the impacts worse from climate change. that tension, that incompatibility, can they coexist? And I would like to, in this, in the next 10 minutes that I have, just to kind of tease out whether they are incompatible or whether or not they can be mutually reinforcing. So to do that, I want to look at how violence affects climate change, or the effects to respond to climate change. The first way is that climate change obviously weakens societal structures. It weakens the traditional coping mechanisms that communities and societies across the world have developed and evolved over decades, even centuries. Climate change is not, a changing climate is something that is not new, and communities have evolved over the years to develop ways of coping with it. What the climate change that we're experiencing now, the extent and the intensity of it, that's what's threatening communities' ability to respond. If you look at the Horn of Africa in 2011, the only country in the Horn of Africa that went from drought into fully blown famine was Somalia. And that was a consequence of years and years and years of conflict that just eroded the societal fabric of Somalia. At a more practical level, it destroys the scientific patterns, the records of weather patterns. The Taliban in the early 2000s destroyed hundreds of years of weather patterns because they saw that meteorology as some kind of sorcery. That, of course, is invaluable material to try to plot and plan and anticipate what the weather is going to be or how it's changing. Similarly in Rwanda, 2 years of vital records destroyed, and also in Iraqi Kurdistan. Another way that violence affects climate change is that it can result in the misuse and reversion of humanitarian responses to climate change. In the Al-Shabaab body in the east of Africa, aid organizations were not able to distribute food packages during the drought of 2011, as a result impacting on people's ability to survive the consequences of drought. Similarly, that same aid package enabled Al-Shabaab to continue fighting much longer than they would have had they not had access to that aid. We remember in Darfur that trees and forests were destroyed and burnt to the ground, having an immediate environmental impact on the region. And Al-Haq, an organization in the Middle East, reported that Israeli forces systematically destroy any attempts at West Bank farmers to introduce environmental protection. Interestingly, also in the West Bank, there are aquifers that are connected to the Jordan Valley. And those aquifers, the Jordan Valley is an increasingly dry area, and it will become increasingly dry as the years go by, so those aquifers are very important. But they are being factored into negotiations around, or the non-ongoing negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians at the moment, but they have been used as a bargaining tool as part of the negotiations. So here we have a climate change adaptation response being completely politicized as part of conflict negotiations. Interestingly and depressingly, under President Donald Trump's administration, he has threatened any UN body that grants full UN status to the Palestinian Authority, the withdrawal of funds from that particular UN institution. So those things, I think, are, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian example, is a stark reminder that adaptation, climate adaptation, response to climate adaptation is an inherently political process. And as a consequence, requires a strong analysis as part of the adaptation process. So climate adaptation, it isn't an apolitical zone, it's very much a political zone, and people who are involved in adaptation need to remember that in their approaches. And I think it's very important for organizations like Christian Aid who do more than just adapt, who try to address the underlying causes, like access to land, land rights, governance structures, community governance structures, and advocacy work. They are things that need to coexist alongside these adaptation processes. The more difficult, the slightly more difficult area or contested area is the link between climate change to violence. And there isn't really any direct causal link between the two. I know probably that's not what the organisers wanted me to say, but there isn't actually really any direct causal link between the two. I think what we can probably say, though, is that climate change is an aggravator of the drivers of conflict, and that's the relationship. Again in 2011, what seemed to happen in 2011 was that young Tuareg men from the Sahel went to Libya as a consequence, yes, of drought, but really the driver of the conflict was their anger at pastoralist marginalisation and the rent-seeking and the corruption of relief funds by government officials. So climate change exacerbated that already existing tension. What the IPCC said in 2014, the IPCC is the big report that the UNFCCC, the scientists that contribute to that, produce every year. It's a state of play of where we are with climate change. It guides policy and allows people to access funds based on that policy. It said that populations that lack the resources for planned migration experience higher exposure to extreme weather events, particularly in developing countries with low income. Climate change can indirectly increase risks of violent conflicts by amplifying well-documented drivers of these conflicts, such as poverty and economic shocks, which is essentially what I'm saying as well. I wanted to just, in that context, give a little example of Syria, because Syria was very interesting, the uprising in Syria in the context of climate change and conflict. In that, at the time, most people made a very direct link between the drought around 2011 and the uprising in Syria. The narrative was that the drought forced people to move from the rural areas of Syria to the urban areas, causing tension over a scarcity of resources, leading to a breakdown in relationships along religious lines, and hence the conflict. But the reality actually was something quite different, and it was in the 1990s there had been cooperative farms and microfinance across rural areas of Syria. It was kind of the only representation of political organisation and political organisation of people in Syria that the government didn't have direct control over. It was therefore a threat to the Syrian regime. It didn't like the idea of people organising around their farming arrangements, and so by the early 2000s they had dismantled those structures. When the drought was at its most intense in 2011, the microfinance and the cooperatives that had provided a degree of resilience for those farmers up until then were not in place and left people very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They moved to the cities, but it wasn't a case of a scarcity of resources when it hit the cities. It was cooperation and a shared distrust and animosity towards the Assad regime. And so they actually joined forces in opposition to the Assad regime. So no, it wasn't a resource conflict, it was actually cooperation that was in evidence in Syria. So essentially climate may have a much more complex impact, as illustrated by the Syrian example, than localized struggles over resources. Similarly, the Syrian example, based on that example, people anticipated that going forward we would see lots of people move en masse across borders in response to climate change. This again also isn't supported by evidence. In slow onset disasters like drought, entire villages or entire cities don't just up sticks and move en masse. They generally move piece by piece, people by people, looking for work. And they don't cross borders if they can avoid it. They go locally, nationally or regionally, but they don't really tend to cross borders if they can avoid it. What that example has, or what that point has in common with the representation of the Syrian crisis as conflict as a consequence of rural and urban people coming together, is that it presents migration as essentially problematic. Presenting migration in terms of a mass movement of people, or as the cause of chaos and mayhem when urban populations clash with rural populations, is problematic in that it presents people being forced to move as a problem. And I think that's something that we can consider as we read newspapers, listen to television or whatever it is, but that is generally the simple narrative, and the reality is something quite different. The Christian aid approach, recognizing these things, the politicization of adaptation and the limit perhaps of purely only a climate justice approach, is to work to enhance the resilience of communities to the dual threats of climate and violence. One of the tools that we use is participatory vulnerability capacity assessment, which is essentially building on the social structures and community structures that already exist within communities. Working with communities to identify what the threats are, what the vulnerabilities are, and to work to develop appropriate responses to those threats. This process, as a direct outcome, enhances social cohesion, and of course, making the process of that assessment, of those assessments, as important as the content. We also engage in power mapping to identify where does the real power lie in communities. Often that power is unseen, so it's difficult to get an entirely full picture of where the power lies. Some people aren't always very comfortable in identifying where the power lies within communities, but certainly for approaching a situation to try to assist people or work with people to minimize their exposure to violence or to climate, is to identify where that power lies. It allows for local leadership to come to the fore and allows local contextualized solutions and responses. But as I said initially, or as I said earlier on, this can't exist purely in isolation. It needs to exist in conjunction with the other type of work Christian aid does, which is building on the rights agenda, assisting people to ensure that they access their rights, that they enjoy protection, that they know their full rights to land, governance issues, holding power holders to account through national and international processes. So it's very much a dual approach of working with communities to enhance their resilience, as well as the bigger issues of land rights, governance and accountability. And finally, just to bring what I've said, or try to bring that all together, as I said, climate adaptation is an inherently political process. The political consequences of climate action always have to be considered. Actors need to be politically aware, context specific, and use the resources and the resilience and the community networks that are already in existence. Developing resilience is crucial, but only in tandem with the other element of work that I just talked about. And then this idea of mutually incompatible agendas. I think that the attempts to tackle violence and peace will increasingly need to be aware of the potential aggravation of climate change and the drivers of violent conflict. And the global security people who view violence as dramatic and inevitable and who prepare to deal with that threat accordingly, which in many ways is counterproductive because it deals with investment in how to deal with the symptoms and doesn't actually address the root causes. But civil society also has a response, or has a responsibility to take advantage of the kind of analysis and the kind of work that these big climate security people are doing, and to try to adapt what they are saying to local responses. The analysis is really good. We need to get better at using that analysis to inform our work. Thank you very much.